Good morning. This is the Macro Church of Christ, and this is our Sunday AM Samuel to Chronicles study. We're in 1 Samuel chapter 19 and verse 8. We haven't got into the book of Chronicles yet, but we will shortly. But notice that where we are at is over here at chapter 19, which is right here. And notice that it's the later ministry of Samuel, and that Samuel now right here, we're going to notice that he's going to come, basically his ministry will come to an end, and then David's going to be the individual that we hear a lot about, although we're going to be hearing about Saul during this time also. Saul's life concludes over here in chapter 31. So we're in this section here that deals with here, and Chronicles doesn't come in until around the death of Saul, and so that's why we're not dealing with it right now. But this is where we're at. We're about verse 9. We're about chapter 19. Going to have a little discussion with Samuel. And then after that, David's going to be the man after God's own heart, and Saul's going to be the one trying to kill him. And so Saul's reign is going to be declining, and eventually he's going to die. And so this is where we're at here. I remember that as we were studying this, or as we were looking at this, that we had noticed that Jonathan had made a pact or a covenant with David, because Jonathan knew that David was going to be the next king. And as a result of that, he wanted to be David's commander, you might say, because that's what he told him. He would be his right-hand man, you might say. And so Jonathan understood that, and Jonathan realized that. But David was wondering why Jonathan was hesitant to come to the monthly meetings and the meals that were supposed to be had with the king. And that was because David was afraid that Saul was trying to put him to death. And so Jonathan didn't really believe that. And so in verse 4, if you remember of 19, it says, "Then Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul, his father, and said to him, 'Do not let the king sin against his servant, since he has not sinned against you, and since his deeds have been very beneficial to you. For he took his life into his hands and struck the Philistines, and the Lord brought a great deliverance for Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against the innocent blood by putting David to death without a cause?' And Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan, and Saul vowed, 'As the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death.'" So I just want you to notice that we covered a little bit of this last week, kind of hesitantly. I want you to notice that Saul made this vow, and he swore to the Lord. And whenever you make a vow, whether it's to the Lord or whether it's to anybody else, you're supposed to keep it. And breaking a vow is certainly not something that kings are supposed to do, but he makes a vow that he's not going to hurt David. And so David basically comes back. Verse 7 says, "Then Jonathan calls David, and Jonathan told him all the words, and Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as formerly." So basically Saul, you might say, repented for a little bit. But then I want you to notice what happens in verse 8 that we covered last week. It says, "When there was war again, David went out and fought with the Philistines and defeated them with a great slaughter, so that they fled before him." So again, what we notice is that David is being victorious. David is winning his battles. And so Saul didn't have any problem with David as long as David wasn't taking the limelight. But once David takes the limelight, even though it wasn't intentional, in other words, David wasn't looking for the limelight, David was just simply trying to do his job. And because God was with him, David did his job really well. And so the Philistines fled before him. Now, as a result of that, we then have in verse 9, "Now there was an evil spirit from the Lord on Saul as he was sitting in his house with his spear in his hand, and David was playing the harp with his hand." So I think it's interesting that this evil spirit comes after David has this great slaughter, because what it is this spirit of jealousy. And you might say, but it's an evil spirit from the Lord. Well, that's true. God is in charge of everything, and God doesn't allow anything to happen unless he wills it or permits it. And so anything that happens, you might say, is from the Lord. And that's what Job's friends were talking to him about when he had all these problems that were going on. They saw it as coming from the Lord. And certainly the Lord was involved in those things that happened to Job, because Job was an individual who feared God, and so God allowed Satan to come and do it. And so in that case, Satan was this evil spirit from the Lord. And so there's these evil spirits that come from the Lord. And this one, I'm sure, is a spirit of jealousy, because it comes upon him as a result of David's success. And we have to be careful about jealousy. It's that green-eyed monster that will get us. And certainly jealousy is not necessarily a sinful thing, It's only sinful when it causes us to want something that we don't have or that doesn't belong to us or somebody else has. And that's what's going on here. Saul wanted what David had. David had this reputation of being able to kill more Philistines than Saul did. He was somebody who was looked up to. And so Saul wanted all that recognition. He wanted all that. So he had this evil spirit. And so this evil spirit was there. And who did they call whenever he had this evil spirit that would come upon him from the Lord? Well, they'd call David. Remember, they'd gotten David, and David would come in and play his harp in front of him. So verse 19 says, now there was an evil spirit from the Lord on Saul as he was sitting in his house with his spear in his hand, and David was playing the harp with his hand. And Saul tried to pin David to the wall with his spear, but he slipped away out of Saul's presence so that he struck the spear into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. Then Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him in order to put him to death in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, if you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you will be put to death. So Michal let David down through a window, and he went out and fled and escaped. Now, as we have this evil spirit that comes upon Saul, it comes upon Saul because of his jealousy with what happens with David and David's success. And so David is playing as he usually does, and there's a javelin or a spear by Saul as David's playing, and rather than being soothed by the playing of David, he's irritated by it, and so he tries to pin David to the wall. It's interesting that we have these phrases, pin David to the wall, because that's a phrase you hear from time to time. I often wonder how many of these phrases that we hear actually had the origin in the Bible or with what was going on in the Bible. And so here, Saul tried to pin David to the wall, and he slipped out of his presence so that he struck the spear into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. And so Saul tried to kill David with the spear, but David, being agile, was able to get away. And so he escaped that night. Now it says, then Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him in order to put him to death in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, if you do not save your life tomorrow, tomorrow you will be put to death. And so basically what she says is, my dad's out to kill you. And if you don't do something tonight, they're going to come and find you and put you to death. Now, what's interesting is we have a psalm, this Psalm 59 that we have right here. So we're going to turn to it and we're going to look at it because it's a psalm that's written about this particular event. And so it's nice for us to be able to put these psalms in some of the context that they go into. So let me just read it to you real quick and make a couple of comments about it as we think about it. So Saul sent messengers to David's house out to kill him, and these messengers were soldiers. They weren't just delivering a telegram or just asking him to come. That they were out to get him. That they were out to arrest him, you might say. And so the Psalm 59 verse 1 has a heading, and a lot of the Psalms don't have headings, but this one does. And this heading is that it's a miktam of David when Saul sent men and they watched the house in order to kill him. And so that's the very context that we have. So there certainly might have been a different time, but this is certainly the time when we can really place it here and know that if it's not this one, it's not this particular time, then it's one similar to this. And so here's what David writes. Now it says, deliver me from my enemies, oh my God, set me secure on high away from those who rise up against me. Now what you need to remember is David was used to defeating God's enemies. David was used to going out and fighting against the Philistines. He had no qualms about going out and fighting against the Philistines or fighting against the Amorites or whoever else might come against God's people. But this was different. This was the king, and the children of Israel were commanded not to harm their anointed one. And so David can't just go out and kill Saul and say, I'm going to kill him because he's my enemy. So he has to wait for God to deliver him. And so he says, deliver me from my enemies, oh my God, set me secure on high, away from those who rise up against me. In other words, David's asking God to take care of him. And that's what we have to do sometimes. That's why the Bible says Christians aren't supposed to seek their own revenge. That's not what we're supposed to do. We're not supposed to go out looking for revenge. That God says that vengeance belongs to him. He's the one that will recompense people for what they've done. And so here it says in verse 2, deliver me from those who do iniquity and save me from the men of bloodshed. In other words, these men were out to kill David. Like I said before, they weren't just messengers that were coming to deliver a message. They were coming to kill David and take David to Saul so he could be executed. And then it says in verse 3, for behold, they have set an ambush for my life. Fierce men launch an attack against me, not for my transgression, nor for my sin, O Lord. In other words, he points out that this is happening not because he deserves it. David hasn't done anything to deserve this. David has been nothing but loyal to Saul, going out and fighting his battles for him. He's been nothing but loyal to Saul, but yet Saul is out to get him. And fierce men launch an attack at him. Now notice that all of these statements are fierce men, more than one. So this isn't just talking about Saul. Apparently Saul had individuals with him in his army who kind of agreed with him. And maybe they understood that if Saul lost his position, that they'd lose their position. And so therefore they were willing to carry on Saul's bidding so that they might stay in power, kind of like Judas did when he betrayed Jesus, or when he killed Jesus, even though he knew he was innocent, in order for him to stay in power. Verse 4 says, for no guilt of mine, they run and set themselves against me. Arouse yourself to help me and see. So he's asking for God to help him. He's asking for the Lord's help in being able to deliver him and take care of him. Now, verse 5, he says, you, O Lord, God of hosts, the God of Israel, awake to punish all the nations. Do not be gracious to any who are treacherous in iniquity, Selah. Now, if you notice in this verse, David is asking for these nations to be punished. And he says to punish the nations. Of course, that's the people. But along with punishing the nations, that's the idea of punishing those people that are not God's people. And so therefore they need to be punished. And if Saul and his men aren't doing what they're supposed to do, then they should be punished as well, because then they're really not Israelites in the true sense of what an Israelite is. If you remember in Romans chapter 9, Paul wrote that they are not all Israel who are of Israel. And in other words, what he's saying is just because somebody is a descendant of Israel doesn't make him a spiritual Israelite. God promises to take care of his people. And so therefore, those people that aren't his people are from the nations. They're from the other nations that are around. And David wants God to punish them and inflict punishment on them. In verse 6, he says, they return at evening, they howl like a dog and go around the city. In other words, they're out looking for Saul like a pack of dogs. I'm sorry, they're out looking for David like a pack of dogs. Verse 7 says, behold, they belch forth with their mouth, swords are in their lips, for they say, who hears? In other words, these men are out trying to get David, and they don't care what they're saying about David, because basically what they're saying is that they're going to put him to death, and God isn't listening, and nobody's listening to what they're saying because they're out to kill David. Now, verse 8 says, but you, O Lord, laugh at them. You scoff at all the nations. In other words, God laughs at those people that are not his people. He laughs at them. And David understands that. Verse 9 says, because of his strength, I will watch for you, for God is my stronghold. So David says that he's going to rely on God, and God's going to take care of him. And what's interesting is as we look at David's life, you're going to notice that God often takes care of David. And it's amazing how Saul almost comes to find David, but yet God is always watching out for David. And so we need to remember that God watches out for us, and he's our stronghold. He's our bunker, you might say. That word stronghold is the same idea as a bunker. It's something you get in that's secure, and the enemy can't come in and penetrate. And David points out that that's God to him. Now, verse 10 says, and my God in his loving kindness will meet me. God will let me look triumphantly upon my foes. In other words, David is positive that God is going to allow him to be victorious. And that's also true in the book of Revelation, where God is talking about those people that are going to be persecuted by the land beast and by the sea beast. And those individuals are going to be persecuted, which, by the way, represents, I believe, Rome's governing power and Rome's religious power when they set up emperor worship. And as a result of that, many Christians were killed, but nonetheless they triumphed over their foes, because the Roman kingdom came to an end, but God's kingdom is still flourishing and is still growing. And so that's what David is saying here also. He knows that in the end, he's going to be triumphant. Whether David at this particular time believes that's going to be a physical deliverance or whether it's going to be a spiritual deliverance, he's positive that he can rely and trust in God. Verse 11 says, do not slay them, or my people will forget. Scatter them by your power and bring them down, O Lord, our shield. In other words, when he says, do not slay them, or people will forget, what he's saying is that if you don't slay the enemies, then God's people will forget about him, because they'll say, well, why in the world should we serve God if the enemies are all around us and nothing ever happens to them? Why in the world should we serve God? He doesn't do anything for us. But if he destroys them, he scatters them by your power and bring them down, then the Lord will be our shield. Then everybody will get behind him and trust in him. Now, verse 12 says, on account of the sin of their mouth and the words of their lips, let them even be caught in their pride, and on account of curses and lies which they utter. In other words, Saul and his men who wanted to kill David were uttering lies about David, that David was conspiring against Saul, that he was out to get his kingdom, that he was going to kill Saul in order to get it. And all of those are lies, of course. And so because of their sin, David is saying that punishment is going to come upon them. Verse 13, destroy them in wrath, destroy them that they may be no more, that men may know that God rules in Jacob to the ends of the earth, Selah. So again, notice that the idea is to destroy them in wrath. And this idea of wrath is a judicial wrath. It's the wrath of a court that's under consideration. And so, excuse me. And so David is saying, destroy them that they may be no more. As a result of that, men may know that God rules in Jacob. You see, that's why justice needs to be administered. That's why evil men need to be punished, because if not, then people aren't going to believe that there's a right and there's a wrong. They're not going to believe that there's a God who set up a standard for right and wrong. And as people on the earth begin not to punish sin and tolerate sin and crimes more and more, then people are going to get more rebellious against God, because God doesn't exist, because there are no rules, because our rules, our moral standards come from God. Every good law that we have is based on God and on God's goodness. And if there is no God, then what good are the laws that people are doing? And if the laws aren't being enforced, then it's just like if there's no God, because nobody cares. So he says, to the ends of the earth, he says, they return at evening. They howl like a dog and go around the city. So they're out to get him. In the evening, they're trying to find him. It says they wander about for food and growl if they are not satisfied. In other words, they're like a pack of dogs that are running around looking to find their prey. And so they're growling around, and that's the way he views those men that are after him. Verse 16 says, but as for me, I shall sing of your strength. Yes, I shall joyfully sing of your loving kindness in the morning, for you have been my stronghold and a refuge in the day of my distress. Now, David points out that he knows God is going to have his loving kindness. In the morning, David's going to be around. And so that indicates that God has protected him and that God has kept him in the day of his distress when he wakes up the next day and he's alive. Verse 17, O my strength, I will sing praise to you, for God is my stronghold, the God who shows me loving kindness. Now, I want you to notice in this that you have loving kindness and stronghold, because that's the idea of loving kindness. God has this attitude towards us of loving kindness, which means he's going to take care of us. He's going to be our stronghold. He's going to bless us. He's going to provide for us and give us what we need and take care of us. And that's the reason why Jesus died, was in Jesus. Then we have the stronghold from sin, that Jesus was able to forgive us for our sins, because we understand we're not perfect. But because Jesus did that, he then can be our stronghold. We can depend on him and trust in him. Which is always funny to me why there are some Christian groups that don't believe that Jesus' kingdom is here, because the idea of Jesus' kingdom is the idea of being able to have your sins forgiven, because that's what Jesus did. And that's the difference between the Old and the New Testament. In the Old Testament, there was just the shadow of payment that was going to be given. In the New Testament, we actually have the payment, and that payment then allows Jesus to set up his kingdom, where those individuals who are his people can go and be rescued and be saved. And so that's the reason that we looked at this. was because it's talking to us about the same time period that we see over here in 1 Samuel chapter 19 and at verse 12 down here, or verse 11, where Saul sent these messengers to the house of David. So we get a little bit of the attitude of David during this time. It's not like David wasn't a little anxious or a little concerned about what was going on. He was. It's not like he just sat around going, well, I don't have to worry about anything. No, he needed to do what he could do, but he understood that God was the one who was going to deliver him. And God was the one who was going to save him. So verse 12 says, so Micaiah let David down through a window, and he went out and fled and escaped. So what this tells you is that the men who were out to get David were surrounding the house, or at least at the front door. There was no back door. And so in order for David to flee, Michael had to let him down. And so he escaped. And of course, that reminds us of Paul. When Paul was in Damascus and he had to be let down in a basket because they were searching for him and were out to kill him. And so that reminds us of Saul, not King Saul, but Saul, Paul, the apostle, when he preached the word, and he had to be let down in the basket. And maybe that's where those individuals got this idea from, was from Michael. But anyway, she let him down. Now, verse 13 says, and Michael took the household idol and laid it on the bed and put a quilt of goat's hair at his head and covered it with cloth. When Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, he's sick. And then Saul sent messengers to see David, saying, bring him up to me on his bed, that I may put him to death. And when the messengers entered, behold, the household idol was on the bed with the quilt of goat's hair at his head. So Saul said to Michal, why have you deceived me like this and let my enemy go, so that he has escaped? And Michal said to Saul, he said to me, let me go. Why should I put you to death? And now David fled and escaped and came to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. And he and Samuel went and stayed in Naioth. And it was told Saul, saying, behold, David is at Naioth in Ramah. So we're going to stop there for just a second and just cover some of this stuff that we're looking at here. So in verse 13, he says, Michal took the household idol and basically, put it in the bed, and she put some goat's hair on top of the head so that it looked like, he was asleep and his hair sticking out. And so when the messengers came in, she said that David is sick. And so the messengers went in and looked, and sure enough, it looked like David was laying in bed. And usually at this time, unless you're sick or really exhausted, you wouldn't be in bed. And so they kind of figured he was asleep in bed. And so when they reported back to Saul, they basically told Saul that David was sick. And so it says in verse 15, then Saul sent messengers to see David, saying, bring him up to me on his bed, let me put him to death. So Saul was out to kill David no matter what. And so when the messengers entered, behold, the household idol was on the bed with a quilt of goat's hair at his head. And so Saul said to Michal, why have you deceived me? So basically Saul wanted to know, why did you deceive me? And Michal said, he said to me, let me go. Why should I put you to death? In other words, she's saying, he said to me, if you don't let me go, then I'm going to kill you. Now, I don't know whether David actually said that. Maybe he did say that to her, but didn't mean it. And maybe he just said it so that she could say that when the men came, and therefore she wouldn't put her life in jeopardy. But either way, that's what she said. Verse 18 says, now David fled and escaped and came to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. And he said, and he and Samuel went to stay at Naioth. And it was told Saul, saying, behold, David is at Naioth in Ramah. Now, Saul now knows where David's at, even though David escaped. And so Saul isn't finished trying to get a hold of David. He's still going to try to send men in order to get David. And so here's what it says beginning in verse 20. 1 Samuel 19:20. Then Saul sent messengers to take David, but when they saw the company of the prophets prophesying, with Samuel standing and presiding over them, the Spirit of God came upon the messengers of Saul, and they also prophesied. When it was told Saul, he sent other messengers, and they also prophesied. So Saul sent messengers again the third time, and they also prophesied. Then he himself went to Ramah and came as far as the large well that is in Secah. And he asked and said, where are Samuel and David? And someone said, behold, they are at Naioth in Ramah. He proceeded there to Naioth in Ramah, and the Spirit of God came upon him also, so that he went along prophesying continually until he came to Naioth in Ramah. He also stripped off his clothes, and he too prophesied before Samuel and lay down naked all that day and all that night. Therefore, they say, is Saul also among the prophets? And so basically what you have is since David has fled to Naioth in Ramah, and Saul knows that he's there, Saul goes ahead and sends messengers over there. I mean, after all, he sent messengers to his house for the purpose of trying to take him from his house. So just because David's somewhere else doesn't mean Saul's going to give up and not send messengers. He's going to send messengers, and he does send messengers to go get David. But it says that as the messengers came upon where David was, that there was this company of prophets with Samuel standing and presiding over them. And so as these soldiers are coming to take David, David's there with Samuel, and Samuel's there with the prophets. And as they're there, it says the Spirit of God came upon the messengers of Saul, and they also prophesied. Now remember what prophecy means. A prophecy means that they began to speak what God told them to speak. And so these men were being influenced by the Holy Spirit and were being told what to speak. And you know, I can't tell you what they spoke, but I imagine that, you know, it's something like that David's going to be the next king, and you know, probably don't hurt David or don't do anything to David because you know God is with him or I'm with him. But they prophesied. Now, verse 22 says, then he sent other messengers, and they also prophesied, and the Spirit came upon them. And he did this 3 times, and there came, and they all prophesied. They all spoke as they were moved by the Holy Spirit, and no doubt they all, you know, mentioned similar information, although it's not recorded for us. I can imagine some of the things they might have said. Now, verse 22 says, and then he himself went to Ramah and came as far as the large well that is in Succoth, and he asked and said, where are Samuel and David? And someone said, behold, they are at Naioth in Ramah. So again, he wants to make sure where David is before he goes. And when he finds out he's still at Naioth in Ramah, he's still there with the prophets, and they're protecting him by the Spirit of the Lord, or the Spirit of the Lord is protecting them among the prophets. It says in verse 23, he proceeded there to Naioth in Ramah, and the Spirit of God came upon him also. So now again, we see that the Spirit of God comes on Saul, as he did the very first of Saul's ministry. If you remember way back when Saul was first anointed and he left, the Spirit was going to come upon him. But then you remember that the Spirit had left Saul when he became jealous of David and was out to kill him. But now we see the Spirit of God come back on him so that he might prophesy. And he prophesied continually until he came to Naioth in Ramah. So as Saul came to Succoth, and he was getting close to Naioth, the Holy Spirit had him prophesy as he's walking down to meet David and to meet Samuel. And so it says in verse 23, he proceeded there to Naioth in Ramah, and the Spirit of God came upon him so that he went along prophesying continually until he came to Naioth in Ramah. And so he prophesied, you know, from the time he asked those men, where was David and where was Samuel at? It says he also stripped off his clothes, and he too prophesied before Samuel and lay down naked all that day and all that night. And so here you see the king out naked. Now, was he totally naked? I don't know. Sometimes that word naked just simply means, you know, they've stripped off their outer garments, and it's like somebody's in their underwear, you might say. But it's possible that he was, you know, completely naked, because that certainly fits within the context of the word as well. But whichever one it wasn't the customary dress of a king, you might say. And so God opened him up and made him naked. And certainly that shows us that God, you might say, had stripped him of everything that belonged to him, and that it was just him and God. And like like Job once said, naked we came into the world and naked will we leave. And so Saul was in his nakedness before God, and God had stripped him of everything. And certainly that's an illustration of God having stripped Saul of his rank and of his kingdom. And God is stripping it away from him, especially as Saul becomes more and more jealous and rebels against God, and rather than supporting David, fights against him. And so when that happens, eventually God takes away everything. When we fight against God, he eventually takes away everything that we have, because the only things we have come from God. And so if you're fighting against God, then who is there to bless you? Who is there to give you breath? Who is there to give you life if you're fighting against God? And so I think that's part of what this illustration is of Saul being naked here. And it says, therefore, they said, is Saul also among the prophets? In other words, is Saul a prophet? Because look, he's prophesying again. And so with that in mind, that brings us to chapter 20. And in chapter 20, we have over here at beginning in chapter 20, verse 1, where we have this account with Jonathan, who is going to warn David because Saul is still after David. And David would like to return. And it's interesting of how forgiving David is, and how many times David wants to return and wants to be in Saul's presence, and is willing to forgive Saul. And so that's why I'm sure he's a man after God's own heart, because God forgives us over and over and over and over again. Now, that doesn't mean we should all go out and sin and sin and sin. But like Solomon said when he built the temple, there is no man that sins. And when 1 John was written, he said anyone who says he has no sin is a liar. And so David is like God, because God always forgives us as we're striving to do better and become more like him. And David would be willing to forgive Saul. And so it's interesting. I just want to point that out to you. Now, verse 1, let's do a little bit of reading. It says, then David fled from Naioth in Ramah, and he came and said to Jonathan, what have I done? What is my iniquity? And what is my sin before your father, that he is seeking my life? He said to him, far from it, you shall not die. Behold, my father does nothing, either great or small, without disclosing it to me. So why should my father hide this thing from me? It is not so. Yet David vowed again, saying, your father knows well that I have found favor in your sight, and that he has said, do not let Jonathan know this, or he will be grieved. But surely as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, there is hardly a step between me and death. Then Jonathan said to David, what you say, I will do for you, or whatever you say, I will do for you. So David said to Jonathan, behold, tomorrow is the new moon, and I ought to sit down to eat with the king. But let me go, that I may hide myself in the field until the third evening. If your father misses me at all, then say, David earnestly asked leave of me to return to Bethlehem, his city, because it is the yearly sacrifice there for the whole family. If he says, it is good, your servant will be safe. But if he is very angry, know that he has decided on evil. Therefore, deal kindly with your servant, for you have brought your servant into a covenant of the Lord with you. But if there is iniquity in me, put me to death yourself. Or why then should you bring me to your father? Then Jonathan said, far be it from you, for if I should indeed learn that evil has been decided by my father to come upon you, then would I not tell you about it. And so right here, we're going to stop for just a minute as we've read that little section there. And let's go through and let's talk about some of these, or some of this idea. So as David knows that Saul is out to get him, David just doesn't stay there and rely on the prophets to take care of him. You know, it's interesting that the messengers came up on David. It almost seems kind of like David was unaware that they would come out that far to get him. And then when they sent 3 companies and Saul, then David figured out that he can't just stay there, because it probably wasn't safe for him or safe for the people around him. So he leaves. And so he comes back to find Jonathan, because he wants to know exactly what it is that his father has against him. He says, what have I done? What's my iniquity? And, why is your dad trying to kill me? Verse 2, he said to him, far be it from me, you shall not die. In other words, Jonathan said, my dad's not trying to kill you, because my dad doesn't do anything unless he tells me what he's doing, and he hasn't told me anything about trying to kill you. So we notice that Saul is trying to kill David in secret. Saul didn't openly tell Jonathan, hey, I'm trying to kill David. He's doing it secretly because he doesn't want Jonathan to know. And so Jonathan is saying, no, it's not so. My father's not out to kill you because he hasn't told me that he's out to kill you. Remember, the last time Jonathan talked with his father said to him that, you know, he swore by the Lord that he would not kill David. So it's kind of hard for Jonathan to believe that his father had to kill him, although David, you know, has had 4 incidents where Saul came after him and tried to kill him already. Now, verse 3, it says, yet David vowed again, saying, your father knows well that I have found favor in your sight. And he has said, do not let Jonathan know this, or he will be grieved. In other words, God, oh, excuse me. In other words, David says that Saul knows that you would be grieved, and so that's the reason you don't know about it. That's the reason that he hasn't told you. But really, seriously, there's just a step between me and death. It's what David says. Now, verse 4 says, then Jonathan said to David, whatever you say, I will do. So Jonathan says, okay, David, you know, I guess I'm going to believe you. And so he says, whatever you want me to do, I'll go ahead and do. So David says that, you know, it's going to be the new moon, and the new moon was basically the beginning of the month, and apparently it was that time when all of the army, you might say, or the leading men of war were invited to sit with Saul. Maybe they strategized on that day, but they would have a dinner and they would eat, and so it was time for that to happen. And David says, well, you know, tell your dad to excuse me because I'm going to go and you know, do a sacrifice with my fathers. Now in verse 6 it says, if your father misses me at all, then say, David earnestly asked leave of me to run to Bethlehem in his city, because it is the yearly sacrifice there for the whole family. And so David says that, you know, it's time for the family sacrifice. Now, maybe it was the time for the family sacrifice, but David up here had already said that he was going to hide in the forest or in the field for 3 days, if you remember. And so there might be the feast that's going on in Bethlehem during this time. And so David might be telling Jonathan, you know, tell your father that's where I'm at. But actually, David was hiding in the field. And I think probably the reason why David wanted Jonathan to tell that to Saul was because if Saul, you know, was after him, then he'd go there. And so he's going to hide in the field, although it probably was the time for the family sacrifice in Bethlehem. Now, verse 7, he says, if your father says good, then your servant will be safe. In other words, if your father says, okay, that's fine, he can be at a sacrifice, and you know, that's no big deal, then David says, then, you know, I am safe. He's not out to kill me. But if he becomes angry, then realize that he's out to kill me. Now, verse 8 says, therefore, deal kindly with your servant, for you have brought your servant into a covenant of the Lord with you. So here's a covenant. And notice that in this covenant, this was a covenant that David was going to be protected by Jonathan, and Jonathan was going to be protected by David. That's a covenant. It's an agreement. And that's part of the covenant that God has made with us, his people. His covenant is with us that he's going to protect us. And our covenant is we're going to protect him. We're going to protect his cause, his way, what he says, and what he wants us to do. And so therefore, we're going to protect that. But that's what a covenant is. And in the Bible, that's generally what they mean by covenant. It's a covenant of peace or a covenant of protection. It's under consideration. Now it says, but if there's iniquity in me, in other words, David says, if I've actually done something wrong, then you kill me. So, you know, why in the world would you want to bring me to your father if I've done something wrong and he's going to execute me? If I'm worthy of death, go ahead and execute me. And so one of the things it shows you is that David understood that there are some crimes that are worthy of death. And those crimes that are worthy of death are punished by death. And it's not sinful to execute a person who has committed a crime worthy of death. That's what God expects. Matter of fact, it's interesting that in the first few chapters of the Bible, after Cain killed Abel, and rather than God punishing Cain, God allowed Cain to live, that the world became very wicked. And one of the first things that God did when Noah came out of the ark was to tell Noah, now Noah, if one man kills another man, you're supposed to avenge him. You're supposed to, if one man sheds blood, then that man's blood needs to be shed. And so we notice that God becomes more concerned with the consequence and the punishment for taking human life. And so some people today have the idea that capital punishment is sinful and wrong, and Jesus, wouldn't want capital punishment. But you have to understand that there are natural consequences, physical consequences to physical crimes that are to be paid for. And that physical consequence doesn't lead necessarily to a spiritual eternal condition. In other words, if I'm a murderer, but I repent before I'm executed, I can still go to heaven. And if I really am penitent and have repented and have turned to Jesus. But the point is that David understood that there are certainly crimes that are worthy of death. Now, verse 9, Jonathan said, far be it from you. In other words, that'll never happen to you, David. He says, for if I should indeed learn that evil has been decided by my father to come upon you, then would I not tell you about it? In other words, Jonathan says, if I know he's trying to do something bad, I'll tell you, David. We have this covenant. I will tell you about it. Now, verse 10 says, then David said to Jonathan, who will tell me if your father answers you harshly? Jonathan said to David, come and let us go into the field. So both of them went out to the field. And then Jonathan said to David, the Lord, the God of Israel, be witness. When I have sounded out my father after this time tomorrow, or the third day, behold, if there is good feeling toward David, shall I not then send to you and make it known to you? If it please my father to do you harm, may the Lord do so to Jonathan and more also, if I do not make it known to you and send you away, that you may go in safety. And may the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. If I am still alive, will you not show me the loving kindness of the Lord, that I may not die? You shall not cut off your loving kindness from my house forever, not even when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, may the Lord require it at the hands of David's enemies. Jonathan made David vow again because of his love for him, because he loved him as he loved his own life. Then Jonathan said to him, tomorrow is the new moon. You will be missed because your seat will be empty. All right, now I want to stop there for just a second. Now, David says, okay, that sounds good, Jonathan. If you can, kind of sound out your father for me and find out, his attitude towards me, then that'll be great. But if it's good, of course, then you could come and tell me personally and it wouldn't affect you. But what if it's bad news? You can't be seen coming out and talking to me, because if you are, then, your father will probably, want to kill you, basically. And so they had to figure out some way for Jonathan to be able to tell David that Saul wanted to kill him, so that David could leave in safety. And it says in verse 13, if it please my father to do you harm, may the Lord do so to Jonathan and more also, if I do not make it known to you and send you away, that you may go in peace. And the Lord may be with you as he's been with my father. In other words, Jonathan says, if my father is out to get you, I will tell you. And if I don't, then whatever Saul has planned for you, may the Lord cause that to come upon me. So basically what Jonathan is saying is, your life is in my hand, and if I don't help you, then I deserve your punishment. Now, verse 14 says, if I am still alive, will you not show me loving kindness of the Lord, that I may not die? In other words, Jonathan says that if, in fact, Saul is out to kill him, and David then becomes king, it's generally customary for many of the kings to go out and kill the descendants of the previous king, so that one of them does not have, the royal blood in him, and the people make him king over the real king. And so that happens a lot, and that happens especially in the Gentile worlds. And so since the kingdom that they wanted one because the Gentiles had one, they probably had the same attitude that was going to happen. And so Jonathan basically says, so if you become king, then show me some loving kindness and don't blot out me, don't kill me. And if that's not the case, then at least don't kill out my whole family. Don't destroy my whole line, but be gracious to us in loving kindness. Verse 16. So Jonathan made a covenant with David, with the house of David, saying, may the Lord require it at the hands of David's enemies. And in other words, if David doesn't help, Jonathan doesn't keep his covenant, then may David's enemies defeat him. Now, verse 17, Jonathan made David vow again because of his love for him, because he loved him as he loved his own life. And so there's that mutual respect and love that these two men have for each other. And it's not any kind of sexual love. It's a respect and it's a love that is based on knowing somebody's heart and being fond of their heart, or being with them in their heart and their decisions and their attitudes. And so in verse 18, it says, then Jonathan said to him, tomorrow is the new moon, and you will be missed because your seat will be empty. When you have stayed for 3 days, you shall go down quickly and come to the place where you hid yourself on that eventful day, and you shall remain by the stone easel. I will shoot 3 arrows to the side, as though I shot at a target. And behold, I will send the lad, saying, go find the arrows. If I especially say to the lad, behold, the arrows are on this side of you, get them, then come, for there is safety for you and no harm, as the Lord lives. But if I say to the youth, behold, the arrows are beyond you, go, for the Lord has sent you away. As for the agreement of which you and I have spoken, behold, the Lord is between you and me forever. So David hid in the fields, and when the new moon came, the king sat down to eat. So let's stop there as we're reading for just a minute. And notice that basically Jonathan is going to make this covenant with David and says to David, well, tomorrow's the new moon. So again, David's supposed to be with his, eating with his father. And so if his seat's empty, he's going to be missed. And he tells him to stay in the field for 3 days, he tells him to go back to that place where he stayed when he stayed for 3 days. And Jonathan knows where that is. And so he's going to go, figure out what his father's going to do. And if his father's out to kill David, then when he shoots the arrows, rather than saying the arrows are in front of you, he's going to say to the lad, the arrows are far behind you, are way in front of you. Go get them. And that's supposed to mean that David better run because Saul is after him. Now, why are they having to do this? Well, they're having to do this because there could be other people there when Jonathan goes out to shoot his arrows. There might be other people around, maybe. And as a result of that, Jonathan might not be able to just walk over to David and tell him, because many times individuals like Jonathan and like royalty would have escorts with them. And so if there was an escort with him, he needed some code in order for him to be able to convey the message to David without really having to see David. And so that was their plan. And so David goes and hides in the field, verse 24. And so David hid in the field, and when the new moon came, the king sat down to eat. And the king sat on his seat as usual, the seat by the wall. And then Jonathan rose up, and Abner sat down by Saul's side, but David's place was empty. Nevertheless, Saul did not speak anything that day, for he thought, it is an accident. He is not clean. Surely he is not clean. It came about the next day, the second day of the new moon, that David's place was empty. So Saul said to Jonathan, his son, why has the son of Jesse not come to the meal, either yesterday or today? And Jonathan then answered Saul, David earnestly asked leave of me to go to Bethlehem, for he said, please let me go, since our father has a sacrifice in the city, and my brother has commanded me to attend. And now, if I have found favor in your sight, please let me get away, that I may see my brother. For this reason he has not come, to the king's table. Then Saul's anger burned against Jonathan, and he said to him, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you are choosing the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Therefore now send and bring him to me, for he surely must die." All right, let's stop there for just a second. So you can see what's going on here. David goes and hides in the field. Jonathan goes to the usual meeting to have dinner with his father, with all the other officers, and David shares empty. And so the king just says, well, he's thinking to himself, well, probably David's unclean, and that's the reason he didn't get here. Maybe he touched a dead body or something, and so he's unclean for the day, so he can't hang around with us. And so he just kind of figured that's probably what happened. The second day, when David's not there, it kind of bothered him, and so he inquired of his son. When he inquired of his son, Jonathan then said in verse 28, David earnestly asked leave of me to go to Bethlehem. So this is where the story about Bethlehem comes in. And basically he says that, David asked leave in order to go. Now, after that, it says in verse 30, then Saul's anger burned against Jonathan. And he said to him, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you are choosing the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness?" Now, in other words, what he's saying is you're choosing David over your own family. That's really what Saul is saying. And that's a really good illustration of Christians, because Christians are supposed to choose Jesus over their own families. Jesus comes first before their families. And many Christians, especially during the time when Jesus was alive and the apostles were alive, many Christians were from the Jewish community, and they were excommunicated from their families when they became Christians. And so they were at odds with their families, and they basically brought their families to shame because they decided to follow Jesus instead of following the mission in the Old Testament. And so you have that little story here, that little illustration here. And so Saul also says, and don't you know that as long as David's alive, that you can't be king? And of course, Jonathan understood that, and Jonathan was willing to accept that. And that's also true when we come to Jesus. When we come to Jesus, we're not king. Some people like to run their own life. Some people like to run other people's lives. Some people want to be king. But when we come to Jesus, we're not king. Jesus becomes our king. Jesus becomes the person who we're going to follow. And so we willingly give up, you might say, our kingdom in order to follow him, in order to serve him. We're going to give up our right to rule our life, and we're going to give it over to him so that he can rule it. And that's exactly what Saul is saying to Jonathan, that as long as David's alive, that you're going to have to submit to him, and you're not going to be able to be ruler of your own destiny, you might say. And of course, that's true for us in Jesus. And so it then says, but Jonathan answered in verse 32, Jonathan answered Saul, his father, and said, "Why should he be put to death? What has he done?" Then Saul hurled his spear at him to strike him down. So Jonathan knew that his father had decided to put David to death. Then Jonathan arose from the table in fierce anger and did not eat food on the second day of the new moon, for he was grieved over David because his father had dishonored him. Now it came about in the morning that Jonathan went out into the field for the appointment with David, and a little lad was with him. He said to his lad, "Run, find now the arrows which I am about to shoot." As the lad was running, he shot an arrow past him. When the lad reached the place of the arrow which Jonathan had shot, Jonathan called after the lad and said, "Is not the arrow beyond you?" And Jonathan called after the lad, "Hurry, be quick, do not stay." And Jonathan's lad picked up the arrows and came to his master. But the lad was not aware of anything. Only Jonathan and David knew about the matter. And then Jonathan gave his weapons to the lad and said to him, "Go, bring them to the city." When the lad was gone, David rose from the south side and fell on his face to the ground and bowed three times, and they kissed each other and wept together. but David wept the more. And Jonathan said to David, go in safety, inasmuch as we have sworn to each other in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord will be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants forever. Then he rose and departed, while Jonathan went into the city. And so basically what we have here in this section is Jonathan finds out that his father wants to kill him. And how does he know that? Well, verse 33 is a pretty good indication. Jonathan had asked his father, why are you going to kill David? Well, what has he done? And it says in verse 33, then Saul hurled a spear at his son, Jonathan, to strike him down. So Jonathan knew his father had decided to put David to death. You think that might be a hint? And so Jonathan arose from the table, and he was angry and mad and didn't eat, didn't fellowship with his father on the second day. And the next day he went out to the field because they made the appointment for the third day. And he's out there with this lad, and the lad is running to get his arrows. And when the lad reaches the arrows, Jonathan says, are not the arrows beyond you? And that was the clue for the fact that David had to leave and run away. And so then Jonathan gives the arrows to his lad, or his armor bearer, this little young squire that's with him, you might say, and tells him to take him to the castle and probably to put him up. And then David comes out to talk to Jonathan, probably because nobody else was around, and they knew that it was safe. And so then Jonathan comes out, and David comes out, and David bows down to him. In verse 41, it says, when the lad was gone, David rose from the south side and fell on his face to the ground and bowed 3 times. So he's bowing down to Jonathan because of Jonathan's loving kindness and favor, that Jonathan was willing to stand up for the truth and stand up against David, as opposed to siding with his father and wanting the glory of being a king for himself. And he was willing to give all that up for David, because Jonathan knew that David had been anointed the next king. And so they kissed each other and wept together. And, and again, some people are going to take this kissing one another and they're going to talk about it, some homosexual activity, but it's not. They just kissed each other on the cheeks. That was the normal way of greeting each other. And they would kiss each other on the cheeks, and they still do that in some European countries. And so they kissed each other and they wept together, but David wept more. In other words, David was sorrier because he was going to have to leave home. He's going to have to leave Saul. He's going to have to leave, his home there. And it says, and Jonathan said to David, go in safety, inasmuch as we have sworn to each other in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord will be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants forever. Then he rose and departed, while Jonathan went into the city. And so there we see the beginning of David's flight from Saul, and Saul's attempts to try to trap him and kill him. Well, I'm glad you came. Hope that you learned something, and hope that God is blessing you. And pray that all things go well for you.